Hello and welcome to 100% Real with Ruby. Today I have Gab Fundaro on my podcast today, and she's the doctor of all things amazing with gut health. And it's a massive topic out there, but it's become this woo-woo thing these days where people are just like, oh, let's not talk about gut health. There's too much crap out there. There's all these functional practitioners that are trying to sell you products and do these silly tests, but this is the same with any field. There is the negatives, there is the positives. There are people that take things too far, and then people that just say, oh no, it's just about the calories. Oh no, it's just about the hormones. Everything impacts each other, and the gut is like the center of everything. Without your gut, you're not absorbing any of the food. So where are those calories going? Where are those calories getting absorbed to get turned into energy? So with that, I'm going to let Gab introduce herself and lead into a very controversial topic on how things like the carnivore diet and even keto can impact your gut microbiome, and not in a positive way.
Absolutely. So I am Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro, and it's so fun to hear like my Australia friends say Gab, because that was like my name over there. And I think for people who aren't aware, like from what I noticed, there's kind of like a culture of like changing names. So if you have like a long name, it's changed to one syllable, but if you have one syllable name, they're going to add one to it. So I love that. um, my background is both in exercise science and then the link between the gut microbiome and skeletal muscle metabolism. So this actually segues really well into answering the question, because my doctoral dissertation focused on the effects of chronic high-fat feeding on the gut microbiome and metabolism, and whether probiotic supplementation might be able to protect against some of the unfavorable changes that happen in skeletal muscle metabolism when a person is eating a hypercaloric chronic high-fat diet. But when we look at the effects of something like a fiber and carbohydrate deficient high fat or high protein diet, it's a little bit tangential to that. But in essence, what we're seeing is that microbiome that doesn't have access to microbe accessible carbohydrates that come from our diet in the form of fiber and resistant starch, they're going to look to other sources of energy for themselves. And those alternative sources of energy are primarily going to be glycans, which are carbohydrates that are in the mucous lining that covers our intestinal cells, and then also dietary proteins. So there are certain groups of microbes that can ferment peptides, or small groups of amino acids. They can produce energy that way. The issue with those forms of energy production are that if they are breaking down the glycans in that mucus layer, they're actually making the mucus layer thinner, and that's reducing part of our immune system, essentially, because that protective mucus layer helps to create a barrier between what's in our intestines and our intestinal cells and the underlying immune cells. So this has definitely been seen in rodents. We don't have as strong of evidence of this phenomenon in humans, because it's really difficult to take out to take biopsies. I mean, we can biopsy the mucus layer, but it's much easier in a mouse model where you can just like take a cross section of the intestine out and look at it under a microscope. We can't do that in humans. But there's a lot of mechanistic data. There's a lot of preclinical data. So that we could be reducing the thickness of that mucus layer. The other issue is that proteolytic fermentation, so using proteins or peptides to make energy, produces some carcinogenic byproducts like p-cresol. So those have been associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer. This is not to say that protein causes colorectal cancer. That is not at all what I mean to say. But it's still important to keep in mind that when we're looking at a long-term dietary pattern and potentially the accumulation of these carcinogens or the repeated exposure of these carcinogens, that, along with other lifestyle factors, could increase someone's risk of developing colorectal cancer. So when we starve our microbes of dietary carbohydrates because we're either eating a really, we're eating a carnivore diet, or we're eating a ketogenic diet that isn't prudently planned out to include enough fiber, that we could be seeing those changes occur. The other thing that happens is that the microbial community changes. This has been seen and replicated multiple times in humans. If you take a human or a group of humans and you place them on a fiber deficient, very high animal product dietary pattern, within 24 hours, you'll start to see changes that are going to bias more toward those microbes that can engage in the proteolytic fermentation and that can degrade those mucin, that mucin layer. Those microbes are going to increase in number, and like the relative abundance, the proportion is going to increase. And the microbes that require carbohydrates to produce energy, those carbohydrate fermenters, those are going to die off pretty readily, or pretty quickly, because microbes have a very short lifespan. So within about 24 hours, we can see these changes occurring, and they can last up to 5 days to 7 days is usually the length of these interventions. Longer term studies that have looked at dietary and exercise interventions find that even if someone has changed their diet and their exercise habits, the microbiome does revert back to at least to some extent, or like very close to where it was beforehand. So the jury is still out on whether those initial really significant changes are going to be sustained for the duration of someone's carnivore or ketogenic diet. But when we look at really large long-term observational studies, what we tend to find is that a prudent dietary pattern like the DASH or Mediterranean style diet is associated with about a 20% lower risk of colorectal cancer than a westernized diet. So a westernized diet is characterized by a lot of refined carbohydrates, really low in fiber, obviously going to be low in things like fruits and vegetables. So that doesn't obviously directly replicate a carnivore or ketogenic diet, but a lot of evidence suggests that really what the issue is that lack of dietary fiber, and that the microbes either die off or they have to find alternative sources for energy. And when they're using those alternative sources, not only are they potentially increasing the carcinogens, they're not producing beneficial short chain fatty acids to as much of an extent either, because most of those short chain fatty acids, especially the ratio, that production is going to be influenced heavily by the carbohydrate fermenters. A lot of them are going to create butyrate, and that's really beneficial short chain fatty acid. So the big takeaway is that if you're eating a diet that is not providing adequate fiber, no matter what the dietary pattern is, whether you're eating a westernized style diet or a carnivore diet, not only are you increasing your risk of disease and producing some potentially harmful compounds, you're also not producing as many of the beneficial compounds.
So another key message that you were reiterating in that is that the gut can change like within 24 hours. So it's not too late to revert back to obviously a more abundant diet that's full of different colors and not just one type of fiber, which I'll get you to explain later as well. But the thing is, the changes that you make to your diet has consequences on your body. And although the gut can change within the 24 hours, it does take time for then the consequences to revert back to normal. And we mentioned that there are these cancer risks from not having adequate fiber in your diet, which is the majority of people, regardless of if you follow a prescribed diet trend or not. Most people are not eating enough veggies, and maybe it's from some food trauma in the past or whatever it was that had you turned off veggies. But there are different ways that you can include veggies into your diet to start to actually have a more healthful life, but they do take time to revert. So with fiber, it is really important to understand the differences between them as well, because too much of one and not enough of the other can lead to imbalances there as well. So maybe you can speak a little bit more on that too.
Yeah, so those the microbe accessible carbohydrates are largely found, as I mentioned, in different forms of dietary fibers. Probably a lot of people are familiar with the term FODMAP, so that's fermentable oligo monosaccharides and polyols. So not all of those are considered to be fibers, but they're all considered to be microbe accessible carbohydrates. And most of them are going to be soluble fibers. That means that they attract water. So if you were to put them into water, they would be kind of like, they would become mushy. You can think of like oatmeal as an example. So those are highly fermentable. And then we have the insoluble fiber, which are things like fruit and vegetable peels. So if you put them in water, they just maintain their normal structure. Those are also potentially, they are microbe accessible, but they're not as easily fermented. So they're not as much of like a preferred energy source. So, and then there are resistant starches. So those are starches that our enzymes can act on to some extent. But most of them will also pass on to the large intestine or the colon with those dietary fibers. And then those are going to be primarily what's fermented, and then they can go on to be used to produce short chain fatty acids. They can also result in gas production. So sometimes that's why people will feel kind of gassy and bloated if they eat a high fiber meal. And these FODMAPs are especially fermentable. And so in people who have something like IBS, that they're already going to be really viscerally hypersensitive because of the activities of their intestinal nervous system, that gas production is going to potentially be really, really bothersome. And those FODMAPs, because they're also soluble, they can pull water into the gut, and then that can lead to stool changes as well. So ideally, what we have is a blend of both the soluble and insoluble fibers so that we can have bulk to the stool, but also pull in enough water, not too much, and that we're also providing a wide array of those fiber sources, because some microbes will preferably use inulin. Other microbes may preferably use like a mannitol. So there are different, like it's kind of like when you think about eating the rainbow, we don't say that just to not just to have a colorful diet, because then you get a wide variety of foods. It's not just about that. It's about the colors represent an enrichment of different phytochemicals, and that increased diversity represents a diversity of fiber sources or types and a diversity of micronutrients. So there really is a lot more to it than just like, okay, this is a cue to help eat different fruits and vegetables just because it's good for you. There are many layers to why it's good for you.
Yeah, so something that I could suggest as a tip as well, so you're not overcomplicating your food choices, is just to look at what you're currently eating and see where you could make switches to increase the different variety within that. Like instead of having one grain of something, there's a multi-grain of something. Or if you have like a packet of veggies that's just one vegetable, get mixed vegetables. Then you can still eat the same foods the same similar foods on a daily basis and still cover all your needs, because you're eating the same thing, but something that's not just one, like uni-focused. You can pack it all into one. But yeah. Speaking of fiber and FODMAPs, we can touch on now the consequences of too much fiber, but also the woo-woo of intolerance tests. And the frustrated, like when people get intolerance tests and they get passed on to some naturopath that then tells them to avoid all these different foods, which, oh, surprise, surprise, it was all the foods that they were just currently eating quite a lot of. Mm-hmm. And I'll let you explain the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. So food sensitivity testing, I think that it seems to be subsiding, hopefully. But for a while, it was like a really huge trend. And a food sensitivity test claims to be able to detect food sensitivities based on your IgG response to different foods. So the IgG antibody is an antibody that your immune system uses to recognize different proteins. It's essentially like a name tag. And while this test does measure IgG antibodies, the problem is that IgG antibodies are associated with tolerance to a food, not an allergy and not an intolerance. It's actually a recognition antibody to say, oh yeah, we've eaten this a bunch of times, like it's fine. This guy's cool, let him through. And this is the way that a lot of alternative medicine or functional medicine style testing works, is that they take a test that has been validated to measure a specific metric. Like, yes, it measures IgG antibodies, or yes, it can accurately detect, concentrations of this mineral in your hair, or yes, it can accurately detect, or quantify this white blood cell, or whatever it is. It is the interpretation of the test, or stool analysis tests. Like, yes, we are, to the greatest extent possible with the way that these tests work, quantifying a specific set of microbes. But it's the interpretation of these tests that is inaccurate and that is pseudoscientific. So when we look at the IgG food sensitivity test results, we're getting a list of foods that our body has seen many times and is tolerant to. Now, coincidentally, one or more of those foods could be something that you have an actual food allergy to, and that would require a screening tool and an oral tolerance test with an allergist or an immunologist, depending on where you are in the world and what they're called. And that uses an actual allergic response is going to use either an IgE antibody, or it's not going to be an IgE or IgG mediated immune response. So you could actually have a food allergy, but that's not the test that you would use to determine that. Now, if you have a food intolerance, that has nothing to do with the immune system, and that's just the lack of a digestive enzyme that you need to break down something in that food. So lactose intolerance is one of the most common forms. That's basically you don't have lactase, which is the enzyme needed to break down lactose sugar that's found in a lot of different forms of dairy. Since you can't break that down, it is made more available for the microbes, and they'll ferment it and create a lot of gas. There are other intolerances that are less common. Like, some people don't produce sucrase. That's really, really uncommon. But in that case, the person wouldn't be able to break down sucrose. So they would have a lot of GI distress just from eating like any source of sucrose, which is like any simple carbohydrates and things like that. And then you may have an intolerance to something like a FODMAP that is universally malabsorbed. So, for example, when we look at sorbitol, that is a sugar that is universally in all humans poorly absorbed. So if you eat enough of it in one sitting, it will have a laxative effect. I point out sorbitol because that's used in a lot of diet foods. It's used in place of nutritive sweeteners because it is a less nutritive sweetener. I think it only has like 2 calories per gram instead of 4, like table sugar would. So if you have maltitol is another one. So it is a less nutritive sugar. It's a sugar alcohol. So if you are eating a lot of like sugar-free products, you could actually be eating a lot of these sugar alcohols that would cause a lot of gas and bloating and loose bowel movements. We also see that with inulin. So that's a functional fiber. It's an isolated fiber that's shown to be beneficial in humans. And that's found in under other names, like you might see it under chicory root. And that can also cause a lot of GI distress because, again, it's just a really potent FODMAP. So these are, ironically, would be considered, inulin in particular is a prebiotic food. So prebiotic means it's a preferred energy source for beneficial microbes. So you could say it's like, quote unquote, good for gut health, but like subjectively, you will feel very bad in your gut if you have a lot of inulin or really, a lot of any one of these FODMAPs in one sitting. In most cases, they're going to cause at least some level of GI distress, some gas and some bloating and loose bowel movements. Doesn't mean that there's any harm coming to your GI tract. It's just that is like one aspect of kind of gut health is, our subjective experience of digestion and elimination. But you can have really uncomfortable GI symptoms and have like nothing wrong with your actual gut, and your microbes are just doing what microbes do, just, happily fermenting.
It's not always going to be 100% all of the time, every single day. So that's something to take in mind as well, because if you put it onto yourself that it's almost like you expect yourself to have a perfect sleep every night, the perfect day every day, the perfect gut health, the perfect poo, and then 1 or 2 days off and it's like a catastrophe. But you have to keep in mind that there are ups and downs in everything, and one bad day isn't a means of concern, or maybe even 2. It's trends over time. And you mentioned sorbitol, and I guess this can also feed into like emulsifiers in food and other things that people might point out in a lot of processed foods, and how
Mhm.
that can also impact not only the gut, but then how that sort of the receptors can sort of feed into the brain and make it like really difficult to stick to any plan because of the cravings
Mhm.
and stuff.
Oh yeah, in terms of like having a really refined diet.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so actually there was a really interesting study that was just published. It is still it hasn't been peer reviewed yet, so I just want to make that mention. I think that's an important caveat, you know, that if this piece of literature is floating around and you go look for it. It hasn't been peer reviewed as of today. But what they did was they put people in a metabolic ward, and so it was extreme. It was very tightly controlled. So in a metabolic unit, you just live in there, and then they use some method of calorimetry to determine how many calories you're expending. In this case, they collected stool so they could see how much energy was lost in the stool, and they fed them a very a controlled dietary pattern. So, and these people, it was also a crossover design. So the people they lived in the unit for a week, and then they had a 2-week washout, and then they went back for another week. And the treatment was either a minimally processed, I think they called it a microbiome reprogramming diet, but it was just a prudent, minimally processed dietary pattern with a variety of fiber, with adequate fiber intake. And then the other diet was a macronutrient, highly processed style diet. So we wouldn't necessarily say it's a westernized diet because it wasn't as high in dietary fat. They wanted to make sure that the macronutrients and energy were matched, and that they were eating at what should have been like a caloric at a maintenance level. So we've got one group that's eating, you know, this sort of like highly refined, super processed diet, and another one that's having a less processed diet. And they wanted to see how it would affect the microbiome and how it might affect things like short chain fatty acid production, and the amount of energy that's actually absorbed versus what was lost in the stool. So what they found was that the people who were eating the less processed diet actually absorbed a little bit less energy. It was about 115 calories per day on average that they absorbed less, compared to the people who were eating the highly processed diet. So the highly processed diet, all of those calories were available for absorption by the human. Whereas in the less processed diet, where there was more dietary fiber, less energy was actually available to the humans. Now, there was a really interesting caveat here, because in the group eating the minimally processed diet, they had a lot more fiber available. And because they had that fiber available, those microbes were able to ferment that to short chain fatty acids. This process is called energy harvesting. When microbes take something that's not digestible and absorbable to humans, and then they convert it to something that is absorbable, short chain fatty acids. That, like, previously the theory was that, well, maybe people who develop obesity have an obesogenic microbiome. They have a microbiome that's very good at energy harvesting. They create a lot of these short chain fatty acids. But this study indicated that even though they produced more short chain fatty acids, and there was a greater percentage of energy from those short chain fatty acids, that still the net loss of energy in the feces was high enough that it was higher because there was just less energy that was absorbable by the humans. Like, the microbes still weren't able to release absolutely all of the energy that was available in those foods. So the take home message there is that potentially the amount of processed food that you're eating, even if we are at an energy matched place in terms of our intake, like we're really tracking calories, that you may actually be absorbing more calories or more energy from that diet. I don't want to say nutrients, but more calories from that diet compared to eating a diet that is energy matched, but less processed. And that could be a change. You know, these people, because it was such a short period of time, they didn't lose a significant amount of weight, but it was like, you know, no weight loss in the highly processed group on average versus about 200 grams after, you know, a week in the minimally processed group. But if you think about that long term, you know, like 200 grams per week, that can add up if the only change that you make, you don't even have to, change the amount of macros. You don't touch your macros. You just say, oh, I'm eating a lot of like highly processed foods. Maybe I'm going to switch to less processed foods and just see how that goes. And maybe that could translate over time to some loss, but not necessarily, because some people can energy harvest, an additional 200 calories per day, and some people energy harvest 0 additional calories per day. And there's no way for us at this point to be able to program your microbiome, to do one or the other, like long term. It really is a result of what you're eating mixed with whatever your combination of microbes is. We don't know yet, like which microbes we would want to have on board to, not have any extra energy harvesting. And like maybe that wouldn't even be a good thing. So I just want to put that out there. Like, yes, we're exploring these things and it's really interesting, but like if someone's trying to sell you some kind of reprogramming protocol, it's nonsense.
Metabolic reprogramming, that sounds like something that will be a trend soon. But this whole conversation right now is really exciting me because it just reinforces everything that I preach every single friggin' day, that your food quality matters. There is the thermic effect of food, and the more processed a food is, the less calories it takes to digest it. And then there's protein. Again, if this was not like in a ward, the people that were on the higher processed diet would have ended up pretty much obese in time to come, because those foods, like we were saying, will increase the cravings. It would become, I want to eat more, because there's going to be no real stop to something so highly palatable that's designed to make you want to eat more. The high satiety is going to make the diet easier. And one question on what you said with the feces thing was, were you relating to the one where they took the poo transplant out of the obese rat and put into the other one?
Oh no, that's a different, So they didn't do that. In this case, they just measured that energy loss in feces. Yeah.
The one that you referred to in saying that in the past, that's what they thought that there
was. Oh, yes, exactly. Yes. So the fecal, the fecal transplants. So that was really a groundbreaking study. And at the time, and not to say that there was anything, terribly wrong with those theories at the time, because it was based on those rodent models. What they did was they took they took a fecal transplant from a mouse with obesity. And I want to point out that these mice have developed obesity because they are genetically modified to develop obesity, and also because they're fed a high fat, high sugar diet, and that is hyperphagic. That just means that a rodent will eat more of that food compared to the regular rodent chow. So they're designed to develop obesity. And they transplanted their feces into germ-free rodents. So those are rodents that are born and brought up in a sterile environment. So they are essentially empty. They don't have gut microbes. There are a lot of issues with those rodents anyway, and like rodent models in general, in terms of like microbiome studies, are for mechanisms, not for translation. But those germ-free rodents then went on to develop obesity. And whereas if they transplanted from a lean rodent, the recipient wouldn't develop obesity. So it looked like microbiomes, that almost suggested that there was a causative link there, that like your microbiome could cause you to develop obesity. So of course, logically, it was like, all right, well, translational research, we need to do this in humans. We need to do some fecal transplants, and this was going to be the next cure and whatnot. And they've done that in humans, and it is not the case. If you do a fecal transplant from a lean donor into a person who has obesity, some of their metabolic markers might improve, and there might be a lasting change to the microbiome, but it does not cause them to then no longer have obesity. Their BMI will remain the same. And actually, some other interesting findings have been looking at like the effects of weight loss on the microbiome, and how the microbiome might play a role in weight loss or weight loss maintenance. And it does look like there is some benefit to giving someone their own fecal transplant post-weight loss. So after a weight loss diet, you've lost weight and you've also had a change in dietary pattern, there's going to be change in your microbiome. which, as we mentioned before, will revert back to baseline, and that seems to, in some cases, correlate with weight regain, but not always. So it's not a causative thing. But
I want to reiterate one thing in here. Yeah. This is why it's really important to develop habits, behaviors, and strategies to keep the weight off, and not to just lose it only to gain it back again, because your body will always revert to what it knows best. Yeah. It is a long process. The more that you rush it, the faster you're just going to end up back at the start. So stop friggin' rushing the process. Continue.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, so there was a study in which they gave people their post-weight loss fecal transplant over the course of, I want to say it was like 6 months post-weight loss, and that seemed to help maintain some of the metabolic improvements. But, you know, over time, they still regained at least a portion of that lost weight. So there still doesn't look like a fecal transplant is really going to be super beneficial for weight management, at least not at this point. Like, we haven't refined it to that level yet. And as I had mentioned before, also, you know, even in the people who maintained dietary changes and exercise habits, their microbiome still over time kind of reverted back to baseline. And it's probably because our microbiomes are not just shaped by our dietary pattern or exercise habits. They're shaped by gender, age, geographic location, medications we might take, people and animals that we're in contact with, our tap water, like literally everything. And so, and that's part of the reason why they're so complex, and it's so difficult or impossible to kind of like hack them or farm them in any sort of way that is super beneficial to us. And to, yeah, look at kind of just that long term, like what is the dietary pattern that I can follow long term that is ideally very nutrient dense, you know, reduces my risk of disease, provides these microbes with the energy that they need to create, you know, to support this relatively resilient ecosystem, and not look for like a quick fix on everything.
Which is clearly not going to be carnivore or a terrible keto diet. So yes, keep that one in mind and make sure that you are eating a lot of plants. And it's almost like Luke Lehman, you would know him. It's almost like Luke Lehman says, eat a vegan diet, but then put meat on it.
Okay, so funny enough, I do know who he is. And I said that, I want to say it was in like might have been 2019, in like early 2019, that I was presenting in New York. And I'm not saying that I said this first, but I may have. But I was presenting in New York, and I was like, yeah, you want to eat a vegan diet. Like, essentially said that. I was like, eat a vegan diet, but like you can add animal proteins if you want. Like, then that really is it. Like, that's just that plant forward dietary pattern. And yes, if you want to add in some animal proteins, it's probably better to go for things like fatty fish and poultry, and limit your intake of saturated fat and processed meats, and maybe limit your intake of red meat. But you don't have, like, there is not a clear advantage to being vegan or vegetarian when we're looking at the gut microbiome. I think I've only seen one. It may have been a meta-analysis. One meta-analysis, I think, found that there was a slightly reduced risk of, I think, like luminal colorectal cancer in people who were following a vegan diet. So no, I'll add that out there as well. But like across the board, when we're looking at vegan versus vegetarian versus prudent omnivorous, that it looks like as long as you're doing either one of those in a prudent way, that you're going to be good to go. And we could say that, you know, if a person's trying to follow a vegan diet, that requires thought and planning just as much as a prudent omnivorous diet would.
Yeah, I would always put my hands down and vote for the omnivorous because of the high, like the beneficial, the benefits of actual animal proteins, because dairy is actually really good for the gut as well and for your health. So that's something to keep in mind. Dairy is actually beneficial. It is not something that's loaded with friggin' hormones and whatever you want to think there is.
Right.
I think it's actually, no, egg and dairy are like one of the top quality protein sources out there as well. So there's something to keep in mind. Even though if you have an egg, you have to realize it's just like salmon. 50% of it's fat, 50% of it's protein. So look for the actual protein percentage of the whole calories when it comes to protein sources. Because if you're in a diet, you're going to want to go for like the leaner cuts of poultry and whitefish and stuff like that.
Yes.
My favorite part, you mentioned the extractable energy, which leads me to the next topic, and chronic dieting, undereating, over-exercising, how that can make you you have more extractable energy, and how your microbiome can absorb more calories from the food that you eat when you're in this prolonged dieting, prolonged stress state.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to point out the address the confusion that can happen, and like address a lot of the myths as well. Because I know that like when people, and I have been there myself, but it's kind of like you get to this place where, in the past, it seems like you lost weight so easily, and now you're at a plateau and it feels like you're not eating anything, and your exercise is the same. You're still going to the gym 5 days a week. Then maybe your metabolism has slowed way down. That's probably not the case. James Krieger has put out a lot of great information on this topic of metabolic adaptation. But it does look like there is some. So you might be burning, 75 fewer calories, I think was the average that he found per day. Depending on the amount of weight that you've lost as well. So we'll imagine that this is an appreciable amount of weight loss. So you have some reduction in energy expenditure, but it's pretty minor. You have a slight increase in potentially energy absorption. You could have some reduced motility of your GI tract. So essentially it keeps food in there longer to try to extract as much energy as possible. The biggest change is going to be your NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Like, yeah, you might be still going to the gym 5 days a week, but you probably aren't exercising as intensely. And then what are you doing for the other time? Are you still fidgeting and like putzing around the house and things like that? Or are you kind of like parked on your couch, or you're sitting at your office desk because you're really tired because you've pushed your calories as low as you possibly can? Long term, like there haven't been very many human studies that have looked at the effects of like long term energy restriction and how that might affect the microbiome and energy harvesting. They have looked at some individuals with anorexia nervosa, which is maybe the closest model for long-term energy restriction, but most of them are in animals that hibernate, and so we really can't translate that to like, is that the same thing as is that similar to chronic dieting because they're like really sedentary? So the jury is still out on whether the microbiome plays a role in those in the increased energy absorption. It could be that maybe a person has reduce their carbohydrate intake, but they have a concurrent elevation in their fiber intake. And so they're providing more microbe accessible carbohydrates. And perhaps the net loss of energy in their stool isn't enough to overcome the increased energy harvesting. Like, that is still a question that absolutely remains to be answered. But it's definitely worth pointing out that like a lot of times people are confused because they're like, my calories are super low and I'm still exercising. But it's like, you really want to look at what else is going on. Like, how intensely are you moving around in the other areas of your life, especially if you like work at a desk or something. Sometimes I've seen people who are only taking 2,000 or 3,000 steps a day, and yeah, they're still working out like they have been for the last 5 years, but like in the last year they're like, gosh, what's going on? Nothing else has changed, well, except for you've gotten an office job or whatever it is, and you're sitting a lot more. So that's the biggest thing that I think is important to look at, is that your metabolism has probably not slowed down. Yeah, sure, you can go get your thyroid checked. That's not a bad idea at all, just to be sure, just to be on the safe side. But if that's come back normal and you're feeling really confused, just take a look at the other areas of your life, like how active you are outside the gym.
Yeah, and this is why I also want to highlight that the 100 to 150 calories per day that you extract less from your food when you eat the wholesome diet, it actually adds up over time. So when you are dieting, eat more of those foods. And this is why I get people to track their steps as well, because as soon as someone tries to lose weight, I'm doing this and this and this and this and this. Okay, cool. We know that. What's your diet like? What's your activity like outside of the gym? And not just on the weekdays, but the weekends as well, because all of that is really important. How can exactly actually, we'll do both positive and negative. How can dieting and exercise impact the gut and then bring stress into it, because one of the passionate topics that we both share is negative body image and fearing foods.
Yeah.
I really want to highlight how fearing food can actually lead to more severe consequences on the other end, because that's like a stress response in your gut.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There's really a lot of emerging evidence now that psychological stress has an impact on GI or is associated with GI symptoms. Yeah, and vice versa too. You know, there's one of my favorite studies. I've referenced this more than once. I just think it's so interesting. Um, and I don't want to invalidate anyone's experience or anything like that. And I'm not like a toxic positivity, like, oh, just what you make of it, you know, mindset's everything. But this really pointed to the influence of thought patterns and perception on GI symptoms. So they, in this study, they recruited people who had IBS, and they told them either that they were going to get a placebo. They said they were like, this group, you're getting a placebo. Sometimes placebos help people feel better. And the other group, they said, you could be getting a placebo or you could be getting peppermint oil. Peppermint oil has been shown to reduce abdominal pain, and sometimes people feel better when they get a placebo. The trick was everyone got a placebo. Some people just thought that they could be getting peppermint oil or a placebo. The people who got a placebo and were told it was a placebo still felt better by the end of the trial. Like everyone improved because they either thought, okay, a placebo can help me feel better, and I believe that, and so I feel better. Or they thought, well, I think peppermint oil could help me feel better, and I could be getting peppermint oil, so I think that I'll feel better. And it was just really incredible to see, like, you know, compared to the controls, like just the people that like went about their day. Yeah, and so it was like, wow, you know, just the belief that like this could potentially help me feel better. And that really does agree with other research that's found an association between psychological stress and worsening symptoms. And I've even found, you know, with the clients that I've worked with, as I've helped them learn more about the way their GI tract works, learn more about the way that food can cause GI distress, learn what foods are high in FODMAPs, and feel more prepared, that even if they do have, you know, a rough GI tract day, that they tend to not feel as much anxiety or stress about it. They're kind of like, okay, I know what's going on. I know it's going to get better. Doesn't seem to last as long, you know. So it's like IBS, like other chronic diseases, it's something that you manage. And I think that a lot of that, like, there's so much to be said for feeling empowered, and that you have autonomy, and that you have some agency, and that you know what you can do to help yourself feel better, knowing that there's no cure and knowing that it's unpredictable, that still goes a long way. And so to your point about, you know, the food fear, that there is potential there for someone to just believe that whatever they're going to eat this and then they're going to feel bad, that they will then feel bad. And it could be that they really are feeling bad, or it could be that something else made them feel bad, but they're associating it still with that food, and then they've missed that it's actually this other thing that made them feel bad. So I agree. It's really important, you know, that we help people put food in a more neutral place of just like knowledge.
I wanna also emphasize in there how stress, because there is the stress of stressing about the food, stressing about, oh my God, weight, fat gain, whatever the hell, how that can cause digestive distress, and eating in a stressed state isn't actually going to help your digestion, which is then why you feel bloated, and then you get gassy, and then you're just putting these symptoms onto yourself because of the state that you're eating the food.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. And then when people are eating really, really restrictive diets long term, that it's possible that when they start to reintroduce foods, they're going to have some GI distress in response to those foods, just because they might be increasing their fiber intake. And, you know, we have to adapt to fiber intake. And that can take days or weeks. But then because they're so anxious about it, and because they have so many food, you know, they've only been eating like 5 foods. It's like insurmountable to think that they have to reintroduce all of these foods. And they're like, you know, it's the same reason that people eat carnivore. They're like, well, I just feel better. It's like, I don't care. You know, it's acknowledging that there's like an emotion to it. Like, they don't care what the evidence says. They know that they feel better when they only eat carnivore. And that could be true. And also, it's not because necessarily you're eating carnivore. Like you could be eating carnivore plus a select variety of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes and still feel that good with less risk to your health. Like you can still try to add some foods back. It's not like that you eat absolutely everything, no matter how it makes you feel, or you eat carnivore. You go through a process of reintroduction.
Didn't the carnivore guy come out recently saying that he got his health checked and all that shit came back bad, so now he's eating fruits and some other plants?
Yes, I have seen that there's been a shift. So now there's like a reintroduction of like, I know honey is one of them, but they're starting to bring back foods. So like carnivore isn't even carnivore anymore. Carnivore is now omnivore. Rebranding it. Omnivore is the new diet trend, I guess.
That's why it's so bad to like cling to labels, because there's still people like freaking Saladino who still says there's toxins in plants. So
Yes.
there's that. There's
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So feeding on from the dieting, the stress, going into exercise as well.
Yeah. So exercise is kind of also a recent addition to gut microbiome science, especially resistance training. So I actually have collaborated on one, like really the first resistance training study of its kind, and we're still in the process of writing bits about the microbiome. But just looking at GI distress, it looks like there is an association between intense resistance training, markers of intestinal permeability and GI distress. And it could be because of the really intense intra-abdominal pressure. We see similar things in endurance sports. So if you're an endurance athlete, there's a lot of mechanical stress. There's a lot of jostling when you're running for a long period of time, just like literally you're shaking things around. Then there's also shunting of blood away from the intestinal tract. There's the buildup of reactive oxygen species, which is a normal part of exercise and actually an important part of exercise adaptations. So you have really all of these sort of perturbations in terms of like physical and then chemical changes in pH and whatnot that have an impact, probably minor short term on the gut microbiome, but certainly on the GI tract. And that can cause a lot of GI distress. And so like people get runner's trots. It's essentially like really bad explosive diarrhea after you go on a long run. Yes, yeah, it can be really rough. And then, but on the plus side, like when we look at people who are meeting physical activity recommendations, people with high levels of cardiovascular fitness, all the way up to athletes, they do tend to have more diverse microbiomes compared to people who are sedentary. And we're just kind of assuming that's a good thing. We don't know necessarily that's a good thing. And they have higher ratios of butyrate producers. And butyrate is a short chain fatty acid that actually plays a role in appetite regulation, in insulin sensitivity. It's a really important energy source for intestinal cells. So we could say like, yeah, more butyrate is almost certainly a really good thing. And so having more butyrate producers is almost certainly a really good thing. So we go on to say that, yes, probably the changes that we see in response to that, or the associations that we see between the microbiome and physical activity and cardiovascular fitness, that's probably all good things that are happening. And we don't see them as much in people who are eating a fiber deficient diet. So you really need both of those.
I remember that study. There was a study with exercise plus fiber, and then those that were just exercising and eating a high protein diet, and there weren't favorable outcomes without the added fiber. So exercise, fiber, and protein are the three things that you need for tip-top shape, pretty much.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like and if you are experiencing GI distress around exercise, you can limit your high FODMAP foods, limit fiber and fats before exercise. Give yourself about an hour, hour and a half after eating before you go do something intense. Make sure that you're staying well hydrated. There's some evidence that having carbohydrates as well, I mean, not just for performance, but for reduced GI permeability. And as long as it's dosed properly, as long as you have the right concentration, about 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution, that should be absorbed really well and can potentially prevent or not make worse your GI symptoms. So there are ways to work around that. But like also know that yes, there could definitely be some level of damage to the actual tissues there. But that's just kind of like, that's what we do when we're doing like a really intense sport. We know that there's going to be some injury or some wear and tear on the body. And that might be, that's just the thing that we take on board when we're doing something like that.
That's why athletes usually have coaches and they usually have guidance through these things, because it's something that does need to be managed from an outside eye. Mm-hmm. Going into this, how can you be? Because I remember that I put two different statements up that got people confused. One was you can be in a calorie surplus but a nutrient deficit. Mm-hmm. And the other one was you can be in a calorie deficit on paper but a calorie surplus at cell level, because you're not taking into effect all of the other things outside of just what you're eating, because there are different shifts in, say, like, yeah, obviously there's the type of macro you're eating, the protein, the carbs, the fats. There's the fact that you're not actually metabolically healthy. So you're actually you have insulin resistance, which is impacting your calories in, calories out. So yeah, it looks like a calorie deficit on paper, but it's actually not a calorie deficit. You're going to need to go lower to put yourself into a calorie deficit. But talking mostly about the gut microbiome on weight regulation, because I know that this is something that you're recently really highlighting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great point that we can be in a caloric excess, but like a micronutrient deficiency. So if we're eating a really highly processed dietary pattern, it's very easy to eat. Like when we talk about energy density, we're talking about the calories really per gram of food. So if you look at like a tablespoon of oil, that has about 15 grams of fat. And so it'll have about 140 or so calories in a tablespoon of oil. It's like this much, it's not a lot. Whereas if we were to look at 150 calories worth of cucumber, would be a huge amount. Like you wouldn't even be able to comfortably eat that much cucumber. Or even, looking at like 150 calories of oranges, that's probably like 2 or 3 oranges. So that's energy density. If something is really dense, really energy dense, that means that it's stored a lot of energy in a very small package. So if you're eating a diet that is like all snack cakes, and candy bars, like those things have very few micronutrients. They have very few vitamins and minerals, almost no fiber, but they're really high in refined carbohydrates and they're really high in fat. And so they're really energy dense, really small package, packs a lot of calories. That can be really helpful for a person who's like an ultra endurance athlete. If anyone wants to see something crazy, go look up Dean Karnazes. He will roll up a whole pizza and eat it because he's going to be running 100 miles, literally in one go, 100 miles. This man needs to be able to eat cheesecake, pizza, whatever it is, because he's burning so many calories per hour. He's kind of like a superhero, though. He's a physiological phenomenon that we don't understand. Yeah, but for most of us, like, we probably wouldn't need to be doing that, and we just need to keep in mind, like, these really energy dense foods are not going to necessarily be satiating. They aren't going to stretch our stomachs and start sending signals to the brain that we've eaten enough. And they're going to be broken down and absorbed entirely. There's going to be no fiber. There's really going to be no energy lost in the stool, because it's very easy for our digestive enzymes to break down all of the macronutrients in that food. And so we're going to have all of the energy, all of the calories available, but we're not going to be getting vitamins and minerals and dietary fiber. So that's where we're going to have those micronutrient deficiencies. And it's not hard to imagine that if you were eating like snack cakes and chocolate bars all the time, that you would develop some micronutrient deficiencies, like you wouldn't be at your healthiest. I think that, and then, when we were talking about with the microbiome as well, like if your microbiome doesn't have access to dietary fiber, that can be problematic for your health. And when we are, and that can also be in terms of like colorectal cancer risk, then we're potentially not producing the same levels of short chain fatty acids, which we now know play a role in appetite regulation as well. So we are kind of losing out on a number of different facets of health. I think where people get confused with thinking of it on a cellular level is the idea, like they might not have an understanding of, like, we're thinking about compartments in terms of like where we're sending these nutrients. So when we send glucose to a cell, we need that cell to be insulin sensitive. Insulin opens the door to allow glucose into the cell. In a person who has insulin sensitivity, this is part of what we studied, what we caused in the mice by feeding them a very high fat, high refined carbohydrate diet. We caused them to become metabolically inflexible. So that meant that their skeletal muscle was not only insulin resistant, meaning that it didn't respond to insulin. It didn't allow glucose into the cell. So there was more glucose circulating. And we know that high blood glucose can be harmful to your health. But these skeletal muscle cells also were bad at breaking down fats. So they would only break down fatty acids partially. And when we have partially broken down fatty acids, a couple of things can happen. Some of those fatty acids can go on to take part in inflammatory signaling cascades, so it can play a role in low-grade inflammation. Or we might store them as triglycerides. That's like the storage, that's what's in our adipose tissue. But the triglycerides get stored in the muscle cell. And that is, unless you're an high elite endurance athlete and they're packaged right next to the mitochondria, that's also a problem. Yeah, and so we end up with like fatty streaks in muscle tissue. And so that's another thing that helps people think about, like, yes, we're in a caloric excess, but we are not sending these molecules where they're supposed to be going. And then that's causing downstream effects of having increased blood glucose, of having triglycerides where they shouldn't be, and worsening that muscle's ability to, respond to and to take up glucose and use it effectively.
Yeah, this is why it's really important to take a long-term approach to improving your health, because a healthy body is a responsive body. And it's really frustrating when you feel like you need to cut your calories so damn low because you haven't done the back work to actually get you to a healthy place in order to not have such a struggle in the first place. Mm-hmm. I want to emphasize the chronic high fat feeding study, because that's something that's always overlooked in how people always say sugar this, sugar that, but they don't seem to realize that high fats, especially high saturated fats, can lead to insulin resistance as well, which is pretty much what you said, but I just want to highlight that fact.
Yeah, I mean, really, if we are in a caloric excess, if we have an excess of energy and we need to, some of that is going to be stored in the adipose cells. I guess I should back up a little bit, because you want to talk about like the high fat and high sugar. So sugar can be stored as fat. Like sugar can be used, glucose can be used to actually form fats, because even though that sounds really weird, we're just talking about moving carbon atoms around essentially. So we can move these carbon atoms around to either store them as fats or store them as glycogen. But once we start getting full of, we've got our glycogen stores are all full, and now we are filling up our adipocytes, two things can happen. So the adipose cells can divide. We can end up with more adipose cells, and so they're smaller, but there's more of them. That doesn't seem to be quite as bad. It's when they start to get really large that they start to send out inflammatory signaling molecules. We call those cytokines. And then those can bind to receptors on other tissues like skeletal muscle. And it's that inflammation that is been implicated in like exacerbating that insulin resistance. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be high sugar or high fat. Could be both, could be either one. It's really looking at that caloric excess. So like if a person's eating a carnivore or a ketogenic diet, but I've seen it a lot with people on carnivore that are like, I don't understand, I'm just eating meat, but I seem to be like gaining so much weight. And it's like, well, yeah, because like if you're eating a lot of meat, especially like fatty cuts and organ meats and whatnot, then they're having a pretty high fat diet, and that extra energy has to go somewhere. It can't be created or destroyed. It's going to be stored, and it's going to be stored in the form of body fat. That's just where that's our energy storage.
Yeah, I thought that was a really important point, because there's not really one, like you can't just demonize sugar. There are other things that can create the negative response as well. There's a quote that I want to highlight that you said. Actually, I want to emphasize one thing on that. This is where you also need to realize that what's going on in your internal health impacts brain fog, fatigue, all that kind of stuff as well. Maybe you can touch on that as well as this perfect analogy I really wanted to end the podcast with, because I loved it so much. Weight loss is like a contact sport, and managing it with protective factors like positive body image, critical processing of media images, social support, and health goals. I really like that group. So I had to add it because I want you to end on that, but also talk about, just quickly sum up the brain fog, fatigue, and all those impacts. And then
sure. Yes. So, and I love that you brought both of those up. So a lot of times, people like to, I shouldn't say people, marketers and influencers and whatnot like to pick up on things that have no known real explanation or cause that everyone deals with, like brain fog, fatigue, acne, whatever it is, and bloating. And they're like, do you have this? There must be something wrong with your gut. And it's like, is it bad gut health, or actually have you been trying to eat 1,000 calories a day for the last 16 weeks and you're just like really freaking tired? Brain fog and fatigue how is your sleep, and how is your energy balance? Or your energy intake, because like those are going to be the primary factors that are really going to drive whether you're feeling chipper and like ready to take on the day, or like you need 8 pots of coffee before you can walk out the door. Those are the big rocks.
I have to add on something else that like gets my ears. I need to get a blood test. I think there's something wrong with me. This, that, and the other. It's like, you've been stressing out for how long? You haven't slept. Your diet is shit. That is why you feel the way you do. What are you hoping to achieve from getting a blood test? Are you actually willing to change what you're doing right now so that you can change the outcome? Or are you just getting it to say, hey, I got this. This is what's wrong.
Yes. Oh, 1,000%. And I mean, I'm all for like going to your GP and getting your physical and things like that. I definitely do that every year just to make sure, because I want to make sure, my cholesterol, everything's good. I have gone through phases where I've been like, this is weird. Okay, I'm getting 7.5, 8 hours of sleep every night. I know that I'm eating adequate amounts. I'm not super hungry. I'm getting regular physical activity. I still need a nap in the middle of the day. Like, what the hell is going on? And I actually did have hypothyroidism, and and there were like GI issues. And I was like, wow, okay, that makes sense. But it was because I first looked at everything else. That wasn't my first thing to go like, oh man, I don't feel good and it must be something wrong with me. I was like, you know what? Everything else is, I've ticked off all these boxes. And I'm going to go get a blood test. And then there have been other times when I've been like, oh man, I'm not feeling super hot. Like, is there something going on? I'm in my late 30s now. And so I'm like, am I experiencing a change of life? Like the change of life, am I perimenopause, but like, the hormone tests are part of and I don't mean like woo-woo hormone tests. I mean like, actual valid blood tests where I can say, can we please check my FSH and LH and all those things? But like that checks out. And I'm kind of like, there might be some phases in life where for whatever reason, maybe our sleep duration is long enough, but our sleep quality isn't great, and it's really hard to accurately test those things. Or maybe it's just, like trying to survive as a neurodivergent person in this capitalist dystopian society that I'm in. Like, that's just tiring. Sometimes things are just tiring. So it's like, we're often trying to figure out what's wrong, and then we become very susceptible to someone selling us a problem, so we'll buy their solution, and like really there was no problem. You don't need that probiotic. You need to like set boundaries and take more rest days.
Just quickly. Oh yes, probiotics. I can't leave this podcast without talking about the prescription of probiotics.
Yes.
Like you go into any women's Facebook group right now and someone says they're bloating because they're all just like girls that hub together. Probiotic this, I'm taking this probiotic, I'm taking these enzymes, I'm taking this powder. Please,
Yes.
please.
Yes. My elevator speech for probiotics is that probiotics are effective, but they're strain specific effective, and they are effective for a limited number of things that are mostly centered on GI distress. So like antibiotic associated diarrhea, traveler's diarrhea, some symptoms of IBS and IBD. That's about it. Like, just if you have just general bloating, there are so many other things that could be going on with that to be causing that. Like, my first recommendation is not to blow $30 or however much it is on some just random probiotic that you walked in and you're like, oh, this is the highest dose, because the highest dose and multi-strain does not necessarily mean it's going to be the most effective for what's going on for you.
It's not specific to your actual issue.
Exactly.
So that I would love to thank you for coming on, but I want you to summarize with exactly this. Weight loss is a contact sport, and why it's really important that we do develop these fundamentals, which, as we mentioned, with the brain fog, the fatigue, the issues with all our health outcomes, it all comes from just looking at your foundations, building a healthy diet, which is plant focused with animal protein, and getting exercise, eating like an abundance within your day, but it doesn't need to change every single day as long as you're getting what you need within that day.
So. Absolutely. Yeah. So this came about, this idea of weight loss as a contact sport, because I started talking about weight loss from the perspective of acknowledging both like the diet and anti-diet camps, and saying that what we're really the primary disagreement is the effect that weight loss has on physical and psychological health. The one side says harmful and the other side says beneficial. And in reality, it is a combination of both. So weight loss is like a contact sport in that there are inherent risks that someone needs to be informed of before they can make an informed decision that allows them to modify or not their body in a way that's respectful of their autonomy. So in other words, or another analogy, people are going to have sex. Teenagers are going to have sex. Abstinence-only sex education does not reduce teenage pregnancy or STI transmission or teenagers having sex. They don't just like stop having sex because they're told not to. They just don't know how to do it safely. Whereas if we teach someone, here's how to use condoms, here's how to practice safe sex, there's still risk. They still might decide, I don't want to use this stuff. I'm just gonna, YOLO it. Fine, but at least they can make an informed decision, and now they know and have access to these resources. And the same thing can be said for intentional weight loss. In some cases, people want to pursue intentional weight loss because they want to change the appearance of their body, because they want to engage in some sport that has a weight class that has a weight to strength or power ratio, or they are concerned about health, and the aspects of health that they're concerned about could be affected by having less body fat. Those are perfectly valid reasons to want to reduce your body fat and want to change your body weight. You also need to be able to do that knowing all the risks, that it could increase your risk of developing disordered eating, that it may not improve your health marker, that you will probably be fatigued. It could affect your quality of life, and that it is almost certainly not going to actually improve your body image. What improves is, I shouldn't say what improves, what changes is how your body compares to society's ideals. And it makes you less dissatisfied with your body because you've changed how it looks. That does not mean that you've improved your body image, because it's conditional. And if you were to regain the weight, you would have more body dissatisfaction. And so the body image has not changed. So I always stress that like this belief that if I look a certain way, I'm going to like myself more, is inaccurate at best and really harmful at worst. Like we need to know, okay, that's not going to happen. So do you still want to lose that last 5 to 10 pounds, knowing that like you're still going to have the same body image struggles then? I mean, or do you say like, this is fine. But, the person who's not doing it to ostensibly improve their body image, if they're like, body image, that's totally fine. But I'm competing in a weight class sport and I know that I'm going to be competitive in this weight class and not in that weight class. And I just want to do it for this. Or I think my body is a work of art and I want to carve it like a big piece of marble. I'm like Michelangelo. I just want to be shredded. And I know that it's going to be kind of risky and it's just for this competition. And then once I'm done with the competition, I love myself no matter what. Totally great. Okay, awesome. We made an informed decision. So I really think it's important that we are transparent and clear with people about what intentional weight loss can actually do for us and what it cannot do for us. And then if we're helping a person pursue it, then yeah, we're like, here's your protective gear, here's your helmet. We're going to help you like with cognitive distortions. We're going to ensure that we're doing this with minimal to like, well, I shouldn't say minimal, no food rules. We're going to do this in a very informed way, and we're going to prioritize quality of life. And when I sell it like that, like it's really hard to like promote intentional weight loss in that way because it's so nuanced and there are so many caveats. And that's why like it is something that I help clients with. But when you are really transparent about it, a lot of times people over time, they realize like, these last like 5 to 10, whatever vanity pounds, like it's actually not worth it. Like I would rather just be enjoying my life. And if weight loss occurs, fine. If some weight gain occurs, fine. But like overall, I have, my health markers, my blood work looks good. I'm living my best life. I'm having a lot of fun. I generally eat a prudent, nutrient-dense diet. And then, when I go out to eat, I'm eating to the point of comfort most of the time. It's just like having this more like reasoned approach. And if you've come from a place of chronic restricting and then binging, and you've been feeling super out of control and your weight has been yo-yoing up and down and you've gradually been gaining over time, it's certainly possible that finding a balance like this, your weight could stabilize. It could be a little bit lower. It could be a little bit higher. But these practices that I help clients with, these weight neutral approaches, are actually associated with more weight stability and less of that opportunistic eating, less of that like feeling out of control and eating because food is there. Because you're like, I can eat this whenever I want. Like, why do I want to eat this to the point of discomfort right now?
That last line was actually that just threw it like that is what you call a good relationship with food. It's knowing that you only get satisfaction to a particular point. And I really loved that we ended the conversation with that, because it is really a holistic approach to your health, your nutrition, your mindset, all of that stuff, because that's when you keep your results and you actually say good riddance to the whole yo-yo society and diet culture, but also anti-diet culture, because they're both as toxic as each other. So
right. Yes.
So with that, where can people find you aside from @vitaminphd on Instagram?
That's probably the best place right now. I'm kind of like revamping my website, but that's vitaminphdnutrition.com. But those would be the best places to find me. And if they want to see more of my writing, I do write for Barbend and I also write for examine.com. So if they want to read all about gut health stuff, examine.com is the place that you would read a lot of my gut health stuff. I do have some, quite a bit actually on Barbend as well. And Barbend is where you can find more content that I've written about things like auto-regulated eating and the realities of intuitive eating and like non-macro approaches for strength athletes.
I love that. Thank you for coming on. That was such a great chat. If you guys enjoyed this, reach out to us if you have any questions, because it did get into the weeds. Just reach out to us and we will be happy to answer. Shoot your scientific questions to Gab. She'll love to answer those as well. And go and find her page. She does a lot of breaking down of myths in short form reels. So I hope you do enjoy that. Thank you.